Okay, I think we can start. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to the launch presentation of ADB's Asian Economic Integration Report 2023. So once again, we want to thank the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy and the Institute of Environment and Sustainability for hosting us in this event. And without further ado, let me introduce our presenter for opening remarks. Albert Park is Chief Economist of Asian Development Bank and Director General of the Research and Regional Cooperation Department. He is the Chief Spokesperson on Economic and Development Trends, and he leads the production of ADB's flagship publications, including the Asian Development Outlook and Asian Economic Integration Report. So, Albert, without further ado, please welcome.
Colleagues, honored guests, and ladies and gentlemen, it's a real great pleasure to welcome you to the launch of this year's Asian Economic Integration Report. And I'm delighted that we're able to resume our collaboration with the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. A big thank you to Vice Dean Bajpai and your team for your warm hospitality and support for this event. The ever-precarious global economic and policy landscape calls for renewed efforts to strengthen regional cooperation in order to address multiple challenges arising from economic interdependence. It is encouraging to report that Asia's regional integration progresses steadily, even as the global policy environment has become more prone to fragmentation after the Russian invasion of Ukraine and amidst persistent geopolitical tensions on the trade and technology fronts, as well as heightened risks of global economic slowdown. In response to this complex set of global challenges, the region's policymakers need to forge deeper and more meaningful cooperation to effectively manage potential negative spillovers caused by economic, financial, and climate shocks, both from within and outside the region. For example, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, supply chain disruptions, and higher commodity prices have threatened food security in many economies, especially for the poor. Governments need to agree to refrain from imposing trade restrictions while improving trade finance, trade facilitation, and transportation logistics through regional cooperation. Our report also highlights the power of regional cooperation as a force for inclusive, resilient, and sustainable economic development. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement among 15 Asian member countries, which took effect in January 2022, is expected to help deepen regional value chains and trade and investment linkages. That said, more effort is needed to seize the momentum to promote closer economic partnerships across the areas of trade, investment, health security, and digital agreements. This year's report features a theme chapter on trade, investment, and climate change. As we all know, climate change is one of the biggest threats to humanity, human health, and national security. Even with ambitious climate goals, achieving global consensus on how to reach them remains a challenge. Asia and the Pacific's remarkable growth has lifted millions out of poverty, but this has come with an environmental cost. Asia now generates around half of global carbon dioxide emissions. At the same time, it is also the most vulnerable to climate risks, accounting for almost 40% of disasters worldwide. The region is truly on the front line of climate change. International trade and investment have been key drivers of Asia's unparalleled rapid economic growth and industrialization. And they will continue to be an integral part of the region's economic development story. But with the climate crisis looming, Trade and investment policies must be aligned to support climate action. Growing concerns about the environmental impacts of production and trade and the expected introduction of border adjustment measures only adds to the complexity surrounding the links between trade, investment, and climate change. The Asian Economic Integration Report 2023 highlights the key premise that through the right mix of policies, trade and investment can become part of the climate solution. It discusses policy options and priorities for expanding cleaner production capacity and intensifying greener trade and investment. This report presents ADB's key research on the issues of regional cooperation and integration in Asia and the Pacific with policy insights. Although the range of challenges and opportunities facing the region is much wider than any one report can cover, we hope and expect that the report will stimulate further debate and motivate academic and policy studies. I hope you'll enjoy this morning's presentation and the panel discussion. I look forward to your questions and comments during the open forum to follow. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let me now call for our opening remarks. Our host for today, so he needs no introduction, Mr. Kanti Bachpai. He is Vice Dean for Research at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy here at the National University of Singapore. So once again, thank you for hosting us, and the floor is yours.
Good morning, and on behalf of the LKY School, a very warm welcome to this audience to a very important panel discussion on trade, investment, and climate change. I learned from Albert Park as we were coming down that the report has already been released yesterday, and so some of you may have already had access to it. I've had a quick skim through it. And there's obviously very, very important work that's gone into this. And we at the school are very, very happy to be associated with its launch. Let me just make 3 points. I know you want to get to the panel discussion. First, the ADB and the school have had a long-standing partnership. And for us, that's very important. It's important because it brings together two institutions that have a great faith in the region's future and its ability to recognize opportunities and challenges to its peoples and to do something about it. At the school, we have a range of professors across the disciplines and researchers who study these matters with an eye to policy. And our latest venture is the Institute of Environment and Sustainability, or EYES, rather evocative acronym that's headed by Professor Ben Cashore, who you'll see on stage in a few minutes. Ben, energized by the Dean and indeed by Singapore's growing commitment to particularly the issue of climate change, how that impacts the economy, how the economy impacts climate. I think Prime Minister Lee has spoken increasingly publicly, including at a National Day address, on the very great importance that Singapore now attaches to climate change. And invigorated by that, the faculty recruitment we did in this area, and of course Ben's presence, the Institute really will take things forward, and we hope to make the school a real hub for research, policy-relevant research, outreach, events of this sort in the years ahead. So that's my first point. The second point, of course, is that the subject is vital. Trade and investment are a very large part of the dynamism of the Asia-Pacific. But there is a challenge, as Albert Parks has pointed out, namely climate change. And as he said, this region will be hugely affected by climate change. I think that's obvious. The costs will be high. But I think we at the school, and Ben in his many outings and remarks and various forums has highlighted this, there are opportunities as well. And Albert made that point very explicitly, and I think that will come through in the report that you're going to have presented and the discussion surrounding it. Thirdly, I'm sure that the launch of the report will be a landmark for the Asia Pacific, bringing, as it does, some of the best thinking on the subject. The fact is that it's backed by a greatly respected institution, the Asian Development Bank, and will undoubtedly, from that position of authority, evoke attention, not just in this region, but around the world. And I think we very much hope that the Asia Pacific will increasingly be a leader in linking these subjects together, trade, investment, and climate change, and the challenges, but also the opportunities that lie ahead. With that, let me just say that I'm very glad that you're all here early, bright and early this morning, and that we're going to get a flavor of the report. Thanks once again to the Asian Development Bank for working with us on this session, and thanks to all of you for coming here. I, unfortunately, have to be in meetings all day, so I'm going to miss what's ahead, but I will catch up with Ben Cashore on the highlights. And with that, I guess I'll give the mic to Jung-Woo Kang, Principal Economist of the ADB. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vice Dean, once again for the warm welcome and hospitality to host this event. Okay, so let me start with the key message of this year's AIR 2023. Asia's regional integration has progressed quite steadily on the various fronts of the trade, investment, and finance. And second, the region has still great potential to deepen the value chains, in particular in the high-tech and the service industries, based on the measurement and assessment. And thirdly, the digital technologies and strengthening the regional cooperation could help streamline the remittance inflows and also accelerate the tourism recovery back to the pre-pandemic level, we believe. And moving on to the theme chapter, the first, Asia has been the net exporter of CO2 emissions, mainly driven by its rapid economic growth and industrialization. And second, going forward, the transition into a more services-driven and the digital economy and the technological advancement is likely to help to reduce the region's carbon intensities in the future. And the last but not least, the region needs to better integrate the various trade investment policies into the viable climate action. So first, the recent trend of the regional integration in the region. Based on the intra-regional shares, Asia's regional integration has been quite steady and also resilient even during the pandemic, as indicated by the inter-regional share of the trade, foreign direct investment, and the portfolio inflows in terms of equity and debt. The only exception is the inter-regional migration, which has declined over time. This does not mean that the absolute number of inter-regional migrants declined. It rather increased, but the more number of the regional migrants moved out of the region to settle in the North America and Middle East and the European Union, for example. Moving on to the next slide. Based on the Regional Cooperation and Integration Index, the composite index which measured the progress of regional integration on the 8 multiple dimensions, Asia's integration progresses steadily. Compared to the EU, Asia's degree of the integration is a bit shallower, but it's much deeper than other regions such as Latin America and Africa, as you can see from the left-hand side, the spider chart. On the right-hand side, we are comparing the different sub-regional initiatives in Asia. As we can see from the right-hand side, JMS shows the deepest level of the sub-regional integration, which is much deeper than the other sub-regional initiatives such as the CAREC and the SASEC. Moving on to the next, on the trade, the Baltic Exchange Trade Index and the other recent high-frequency data all point to the weakening global trade environment on the left side. On the right-hand side, the manufacturing PMI, the new export orders, sub-index for both the world and the region, shows also weakening the external demand environment for the region. And then the manufacturing, PMI stocks of the finished good, which is represented by the dotted yellow line, also indicates the elevated level of the inventory, which does not bode well for the short-term prospect of the region trade growth either. Moving on to the FDI story, the cross-border investment globally was quite robust in 2021 over 2020, but the growth momentum was tempered since the second quarter of the last year. On the right-hand side, we can see that the similar trend for the region, and then the growth momentum of the FDI influenced region is also declining since the second quarter of last year, and coming into this year, we also forecast the FDI momentum could be a bit subdued for this year. And in particular, the M&A front, because of the tightening global liquidity conditions, and then there are some repercussions from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, also the looming risks of the global economic slowdowns, among others. So moving on to the remittance stories, remittance inflows were quite resilient during the pandemic, after dipping slightly by 1.5% in 2020. It rebounded quite quickly by up to the 3.4% in 2021, and also the 2022 for the region, the remittance inflows is expected to have increased by up to 4.7%. So remittance inflows shows quite a resilient trend. On the other hand, the international tourism arrivals declined quite precipitously in 2021, mainly due to some of the remaining border restriction measures being imposed by some of the regional economies in the region. In particular, PRC tourists, number of PRC tourists plunged quite dramatically in 2021. But coming into the 2022, although the international tourism arrivals into the region shows some checkered pace of recovery, but we expect the recent PRC reopening can provide the positive momentum going forward. So issues and way forward. The Asia's inter-regional trade share was growing quite steadily over time, in contrast with the quite stable trend for the EU plus UK and North America. On the right-hand side, we show the Asia and the Pacific excluding the PRC's trade share with the other economies. As we can see from the right-hand side chart, Asia's trade partners have become more diversified over the past decades or so. In particular, the PRC's weight has increased, almost quadrupled over the past 30 years or so. Moving on to the regional value chain stories based on ADB's regional value chain participation rate, the region's value chain seems to be more weighted in the primary and the low-tech sectors, as you can see from the bar chart, compared to the high-tech and the medium technology and the business service sectors. This suggests that the region has a great potential to intensify the stronger regional cooperation in high-tech and service industries, and also lower the trade barriers among each other. So moving on to the food and the energy price hikes. The food and the energy price spikes, which were mainly stoked by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, have subsided gradually over time, almost going back to the pre-February level by the end of last year, but still some uncertainties lie ahead, subject to the future evolution of the geopolitical tensions and the potential bottlenecks and supply chain, and so the increasing demand of the oil and the gas when the summer driving season gets closer. So in fact, many of the trade restrictions, including export bans, quotas, and licensing requirements, were imposed during the phases of the price hikes of the key commodities, exacerbating the price escalation of the key products. Thus, going forward, we believe that the prohibiting the export restriction through international cooperation will be crucial, and also promoting the multilateral cooperation for public stock holding and streamlining the supply chain logistics through trade facilitation efforts will help ease the price of the key commodities in the future. On the FDI front, as measured by the Herfindahl Market Concentration Index, FDI consideration by both investor source and sector have been declining globally over time. For the region, the investor source consideration rate is among the lowest globally. When it comes to the sector consideration, the degree of the consideration is a bit higher, but still close to the world average level. On the other hand, we can still see that some quite a significant degree of heterogeneity across economies on the right-hand side, the bar chart. So for those economies with the relatively higher level of the FDI source consideration could benefit from diversifying their target investor source in case that their host economies go through some kind of economic shocks or the geopolitical tensions, among others. So actually, the remittance costs are the major bottlenecks in streamlining the cross-border remittance flows. When it comes to the region's remittance cost, the remittance cost for the region stayed a bit lower level at around the 5% than the world average at 6%, but it is still higher than the SDG goal of the 3%. And in terms of the mode of payment, as you can see from this bar chart, mobile money or the mobile transfer apps shows the most efficient mode of payment in terms of cost effectiveness. So this means that the region can benefit from expanding the digital infrastructure and also enhancing the digital connectivity through regional and the international collaboration and cooperation going forward. When it comes to the tourism industry, still the global economic slowdown and the higher level of travel costs under the inflation, and also, as I mentioned, still remaining some of the border restriction measures imposed by some of the regional economies are still major obstacles to the tourism recovery, full-fledged tourism recovery in the region. So going forward, we believe that the regional cooperation to address the border measures will be crucial, and also the expanding the investment in tourism infrastructure and also harnessing the digital technology to support evidence-based decision-making will help accelerate the recovery of tourism industry in the region back to the pre-pandemic level, we believe. So now moving on to the theme chapter, before I move on to my presentation, we will play a short video clip as an introduction.
Asia and the Pacific is on the front line of climate change, with high exposure to extreme weather and many people living in low-lying coastal areas. Almost 40% of disasters worldwide have occurred in Asia and the Pacific. With its rapid expansion of production capacity, Asia has become the major producer and exporter, serving growing global demand. Asia is also a net exporter of carbon dioxide emissions. The region's rapid economic growth and industrialization has increased CO2 emissions, despite the carbon-reducing effects of technological advancements. The region needs to embrace climate-smart policies to ensure trade and investment can be part of the climate solutions. Policymakers can focus on 4 pillars: promoting trade in environmental goods and services, nurturing green businesses, enhancing international cooperation on regulations, and developing carbon pricing mechanisms. Environmental goods and services such as solar panels, wind turbines, and wastewater technologies can help use resources more efficiently and reduce environmental impacts. International and regional cooperation is essential for the development of a green and sustainable trading system. It's crucial to ensure that certification systems are interoperable and that regulations are coherent. It's also important to strengthen collaboration on a green economy through trade agreements, investment treaties, and other initiatives. While considering border carbon adjustments mechanisms, governments must carefully calibrate the impacts. Economies in the region need to be prepared for a changing trade environment. Ultimately, the most efficient measure for reducing carbon emissions and carbon leakages across borders is to foster international carbon markets. To discover more, Read the latest Asian Economic Integration Report.
So actually, the CO2 emissions are the largest contributor to the climate change, accounting for around 76% of the global greenhouse gas emissions, followed by the methane at around 16%. As the gap between the domestic production and demand is closed by the international trade, CO2 emissions also move across the borders, embodied into exports and imports. So that's the basis of our exercise and analysis with this theme chapter. Using the CO2 emissions embodied in international trade database of OECD, we have estimated Asia's production and demand-based CO2 emissions in this chart. As you can see, both have increased quite rapidly over the past decades or so, although the recent trend is showing the moderating rate of increase. The main driver should be the region's remarkable achievement in terms of economic growth and the growth of manufacturing, which should have also contributed to increasing CO2 emissions as a byproduct. By consuming the less CO2 emissions than the produced, the region has consistently been the net CO2 emissions exporter to the rest of the world. By a mirror image, the rest of the world has been the consistently net CO2 emissions importer. So moving on to the next slide. As an economy grows, the economy size grows, the economy tends to produce more CO2 emissions. So we need to normalize the economic size factor to compare the economies and the regions on a similar scale. So here we have normalized the CO2 emissions for the region using the GDP as well as the export and imports. So as you can see from the chart, Asia's CO2 emissions intensity, so both exports and imports have declined quite dramatically over the past decades or so. The emission-reducing technologies and the stricter environmental regulations over time, and also growing the environmental consciousness should have all contributed to this remarkable achievement for the region. But nevertheless, as you can see from the chart, in terms of both the CO2 emission intensity of exports and imports, the region still records the highest level globally. So moving on to the next slide. After the economic size factor has been normalized, we examine potential other main drivers which can influence the region's carbon footprint. First factor is the industrial structure of the region. We have classified all the sectors into three categories of most carbon-intensive, more carbon-intensive, and less carbon-intensive sectors. When first two categories are combined, these sectors account for 61% Asia's total exports, in contrast with the 41% for the EU plus UK and another 37% for the North America. So this means that the Asian industrial structure is biased toward a bit dirtier industries compared to the other advanced economies. As you can see on the left-hand side chart, usually the services produce less CO2 emissions. This means that Asia's heavier reliance on manufacturing for both production and trade should be among the factors which can influence the Asia's carbon intensity footprint. Going forward, as many regional economies transition into more service-driven and the digital economies, we believe that the factor of the influence of this factor is likely to lessen over time going forward. So moving on to the sector level picture, which can assess the impact of technological advancement at the sector level. So here we are showing the carbon intensity across the economic sector level carbon intensity of the three most carbon-intensive sectors based on the data. As we can see from this chart, many of the Asian economies are positioned at the upper spectrum of the country rankings because of their relatively large amount of the carbon intensity. But this may not be the whole story. For example, in the case of Brunei Darussalam and Cambodia, their carbon intensity in the basic metals and the fabricated metal product showed even lower level than the advanced economies. This is because these economies can still engage in the different the energy sources and also engage in different production technologies. So highlighting the importance of technological advancement in reducing the region's carbon intensity in the future. So moving on to the next slide, as was highlighted by Albert Box, our Chief Economist opening remarks, we believe that with the right mix of policies, trade and investment can become part of the climate solutions. And then as we have shown through the video clip, we are illustrating 4 key priority areas, including the trade in environmental goods and services, nurturing green businesses through regulation standards and certifications, and the trade investment agreements, and last but not least, the carbon pricing mechanism. So let me just quickly cover one by one. So the trade in environmental goods and services, actually the technological environment for the environmental goods and services has improved quite significantly over the past decades or so. As you can see from the left-hand side chart, the price of solar modules has already converged below the $1 per watt level globally. And then based on the APEX 54, the list of the environmental goods, Asia accounts for around 45% environmental goods trade globally. But the region's share out of the environmental services is still below 2% level. Given the positive impact of environmental goods and services in the lowering the adoption cost of the green technologies and fostering the technological spillovers, we believe that the regional economies need to lower their trade barriers unilaterally or through the regulatory cooperation, and also international cooperation to clarify the definition of and scope of the environmental goods and services, and the lower trade barriers will be crucial going forward. And the second, the nurturing green business. Actually, the environmental laws, regulations, and standards and certifications can reduce the carbon emissions and also accelerate the switch into the greener technological production technologies. In our report, we are in particular highlighting the importance of certifications. Actually, as of 2020, Asian businesses are accounting for 63% of the global ISO 14001 certifications on environment. But this is mainly being led by the business in PRC and then by the Japan. So we believe that the broader scope of the regional businesses should be able to participate in this initiative. While proliferating, the certification should not be involving the higher regulatory burdens not to become non-tariff barriers, and also interoperability and regulatory harmonization will become crucial through the regional cooperation and collaboration going forward. And the third, environment and the climate change related the provisions are increasingly becoming the crucial part of the regional trade agreement, but the region's progress is still slow on this front. Then in the similar vein, the only 10% of the regional economies' bilateral investment treaties have some form of the environmental reference up to now. So going forward, we think that the strengthening the environmental provisions and climate change-related provisions, and also having a separate chapters on these issues will help strengthen the regional economies' the environmental commitment through the RTAs going forward. And then in the future, we think that the green economic agreements will likely to gather more interest from the regional policymakers as a viable tool to combine the national level industrial policy commitment with the legal undertaking of the regional trade agreements. So lastly, the carbon pricing mechanism is the integral part of the global climate change policy architecture. But the region has yet to seize the full momentum. As of now, only 2 economies, Japan and Singapore, are implementing carbon tax, and another 4 economies are implementing national-level emission trading system. In the meantime, the border carbon adjustment mechanism is to curb the carbon leakages across the borders. And as we know, the EU is planning to implement the carbon border adjustment mechanism, so-called the CBAM, from 2026 after the reporting and the monitoring period from October this year. It is likely that the CBAM of the EU will have a negative impact to the welfare level of developing economies in the world. And then its negative impact is likely to be more acute to the economies in Africa, Middle East, and the non-EU European economies because of their greater exposure of their trade to the EU. But even within Asia, some sub-regions could be exposed to relatively more risks than others. For example, in the case of Central Asia, mainly due to their large amount of aluminum and fertilizer export to EU, and also in the case of South Asian Pacific, due to their absence of carbon pricing mechanism, and also relatively lower statistical capacity in reporting and monitoring. So ultimately, we believe that the global carbon pricing mechanism should be the best solution to address the carbon leakage across the borders, and in particular, the bottom-up approach, as outlined in the Article 6.2 of the Paris Agreement, could lay the foundation for the global carbon market mechanism ultimately, and as an intermediate step, the direct and indirect linking of the national emission system and also regional carbon market alliances can provide important venue to facilitate the trade in the carbon assets, and then forge the regulatory harmonization among the different emission systems, and also facilitate the trade of the carbon assets in the future. So this means that the importance of the regional cooperation and collaboration will become more imperative than ever going forward. Thank you very much for your attention. Yeah. So with that, now let me call the Dr. Albert Bach, the Chief Economist, to moderate the panel session with the panelists. Okay, thank you, Albert.
Thank you. So it's a great pleasure for me to moderate the panel discussion, and I'd like to call up our three panelists. The first is Benjamin Cashore. So maybe you can just come out on stage. Ben is the Li Ka Shing Chair in Public Management of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy here at National University of Singapore, and is the director of the school's Institute for Environment and Sustainability, or EYES. You're supposed to go like this when you say EYES. Right. Our second panelist is Emma Eisbeth, thanks. Please come up, Emma. Emma is a professor at the ANU School of Law and the Associate Director for Research for the Zero Carbon Energy for the Asia Pacific Grand Challenge at the Australian National University, and has been doing work recently on the intersection of trade-related climate policy and green industrial policy. And our third panelist is from ADB, Rolando Avendano. Do you want to come on up? Rolando is an economist in the Economic Research and Cooperation Department, and his research focuses on financial and international economics with an emphasis on regional integration, competitiveness, and foreign direct investment. So I'm going to sit over here, and we'll have a discussion. Okay, so I'm going to start with a round of questions. Later, there'll be an opportunity for the audience to ask questions as well. So please think of questions that you have related to the comments made here or related to the report that was presented by Jong Woo. So the first question, I want to start in the order of introduction for Ben. So you've been doing work on the role of private or market-driven governance systems in climate policy. And so I'm wondering what you see as the role of these types of systems in affecting management and business practices. How can we really get businesses involved in the decarbonization agenda?
Great, thank you very much. First of all, let me say wonderful to be here and congratulations on a truly impressive report. I've been working on climate change and biodiversity for a quarter century now, and I've never seen so much interest, not just in identifying the problem, but also the solutions. And this report is a really good example of that, as is the proliferation of efforts the Singapore government is doing just in the last year, the announcements have been so crazy. As a policy scientist, I might please just stop for a second so we can just get to understand what's going on. There's so much happening that's so exciting. And as somebody who's worked on market mechanisms and the role of private governance, I've been thinking a lot about these developments. I've been working on these questions for also a long time. And it's always dangerous to ask somebody a question, what are the lessons from this research when you have just a few minutes. But let me highlight a few things that are important about this journey, where I worked a lot on how we certify commodities as part of sustainable future, from forest certification to palm oil. And of course, they bring in questions of biodiversity conservation, and of course, in the last 10 years or so, how they integrate with the climate mechanisms. And I think they give lessons for the current proliferation of efforts right now. So first of all, it's fair to say that certification of commodity production, because they cut across supply chains, offer a really important pathway to create a level playing field in the global economy in which trade does not foster a ratcheting down of standards, but actually can reward and provide incentives for ratcheting up. And we want to find these ratcheting up mechanisms in this world, as this report has identified. Despite challenges of globalization, we also have opportunities to ratchet up standards along transnational mechanisms. And certification systems play a really important role already doing that, but it can also be built up even better by creating the incentives and the consumer demand and the producer demand for doing so. They do a really good job of providing standards that ratchet up versus down commodity practices. But by themselves, everybody agrees they're not enough. So they've engaged in both biodiversity conservation as well as climate change. But these standards recognize that they need to integrate with public policy processes as well. And in fact, this report highlights that. So the question becomes, what's the appropriate mix for doing so, the policy mix that might foster synergies across sectors and draw on market mechanisms with public policy? And it's not an easy question, but I want to give you an example, and then we can come back to some more ideas later as we have the conversation continue. The example is the following. I've worked on eco-labeling for many years, and one example of this is the Forest Stewardship Council. And they have a biodiversity regulation inside their certification standards that requires that any firm being certified set aside some land for what's called high conservation value forests. Now that sounds great, and it is great, but it does come at a cost to the firm's bottom line, unless they can find a way to get incentives and consumer demand to outweigh those costs. But there's another solution as well, and that is that you could imagine getting certified in a landscape in which the landscape itself has, let's say, 30% conservation, which is the latest goal by the Biodiversity Convention. And you could therefore say, I want my high conservation value effort to be not included in my own little small forest land that I'm certified, but in the landscape itself. What that would do is it would actually create incentives for companies to lobby governments to conserve land elsewhere in the landscape, therefore reinforcing their economic incentives, but also creating cross-coalitional interests around ratcheting up standards. That's one example of many about how you think about policy mixes against the problems that we face. And I just want to conclude by saying carbon and climate change is now a key part of forest conservation and land use change. We've got an amazing center for nature-based climate solutions here at NUS, and now EYES is working a lot on these questions. So the issue is, how do we do this well? We have to learn from prior frustrations. So 15 years ago, there was this acronym called Reduced Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation, REDD+. Still exists, but all the creators 15 years ago thought it would have transformative effects. The World Bank even said it's going to be transformative in reducing deforestation and decarbonization in Southeast Asia. But it hasn't achieved what the creators wanted. At EYES, and as part of a broader group here at Lee Kuan Yew School, we want to think about three things that have to be done now if we can open the door of increases in impacts versus the door of frustrations over time. So how do we open the door we want to open? We have three things we think we have to do. One is better attention to policy design that thinks about these policy mixes and across sector impacts, policy design. The other is policy dialogues, where the smart people in the world come together and rule out bad experiments. So you actually focus on those ones that have a chance of making a difference and do impact analysis on the ones that have potential. So designs around mixes. And then finally, policy pathways. The world is not linear. It doesn't go A causes B. The world is multiple step. And each step's got its own logic to it that requires we're all understanding what step we're on. And we think the combination of policy design and mixes, policy dialogues, and policy pathways can actually help us open up door number 2. So I'll stop there for now. A lot more to say, but that's my opening sort of set of thoughts.
Great. So I appreciate this emphasis on certification systems where governments need to work with business communities to develop standards that create incentives and reward businesses for green practice. Okay, let me move to Emma next. So as you know, the report emphasizes the potential of green economy agreements as one way that international cooperation can foster more tangible results in climate policy. And a prime example is the recent Australia-Singapore Green Economy Agreement, which the report really highlights as kind of frontier practice, if you will, in terms of what we've seen thus far. I was wondering if you would say a few words about the strengths and limitations of this agreement, and is it replicable, or broadly, where do you see the future of international cooperation in this space going?
Thanks so much, Albert, and thanks also for the invitation here. It's a fantastic event, and congratulations on the report. I see formal, fully fledged green economy agreements like that between Australia and Singapore as the end game almost for a broader set of agreements that I would refer to as international green economy collaborations. And so these can range from anywhere from a sort of 1 to 2 page joint statement of intent or MOU all the way to a fully fledged green economy agreement. Broadly, we see 3 or maybe 4 different objectives of these international green economy collaborations, starting from what I would call international green industrial policy, that is working together to address the market failures in economic jargon that are inhibiting the development of shared green technology pathways and shared green supply chains, so both that innovation and that industry policy element. The other very important aspect of these collaborations is, as we see the proliferation of climate policy and green industrial policy, we also see the potential for non-tariff barriers to trade and investment. So these collaborations, and particularly the regulatory collaboration and alignment within these, are really about stopping us from shooting ourselves in the foot by reducing the potential for clashes between our own green industrial policies. And the third set that we see, or third type of objective, which some agreements have, is really to provide better regulation and governance of the financial flows that Annex 2 countries to the Kyoto Protocol have promised and have failed to deliver on. And even where they have delivered, there's been concerns about the governance around them and the amount of technology transfer. And so, depending on the mix, the partners involved in the collaboration and their objectives, you can sort of pick and choose from those 4 different elements and try to design the right type, because a fully fledged regulatory collaboration of the extent that we're seeing between Australia and Singapore, that requires a high degree of alignment in your governance systems and also a very advanced governance and bureaucracy.
Okay, great. So very important to try to align policies really on the industrial side, on the non-tariff barriers, and in the regulatory and governance systems. Okay, let me turn to Rolando, and I want to ask a question right up your alley, which is about FDI. So can you talk about the key areas in investment policy where developing Asia needs to focus if they want to make FDI more part of the climate solution?
Sure. Thank you, Albert. And well, it's an honor to be in this very distinguished panel. So I'll try to make it brief and maybe complement with other ideas. In In the report, as you have seen, we focus on economic integration issues. So cross-border investment is one of the big areas where we try to explore further how investment, how trade can contribute to climate mitigation policies, specifically for this report. And we highlight 4 areas. So let me start with the one that is more cross-border international investment regimes, which is clearly an area where there is a lot of work going on. And I see even in the audience some scholars who are working on this area. There seems to be an agreement, a consensus that these investment frameworks are not really aligned with the decarbonization agenda and goals. The question has been, so what do we do next? How do we really align them better? And there are different areas that have been under discussion, especially in the last couple of years, not only on giving more policy space, for example, for environmental regulation, climate including climate issues on the agreements, but also trying to understand what are the most effective of these measures. In the report, we highlight some of these options. One is the option of including a model agreement, as it was mentioned in the presentation by Youngwoo, the inclusion of exceptions on climate policy, and caps in the type of compensation caps to discourage investment on highly polluting or extractive industries. But also we try to balance also not only the regulatory aspects with the more facilitating investment facilitation aspects, which are also important, including, for example, enlarging market access or how to build some investment facilitation framework that can be also directed at green industries. So it's still an ongoing discussion. I don't think there is still a clear consensus, but we try to highlight these issues because at the moment they are not really discussed in the region extensively. A second aspect that we look at is in terms of investments and green investment incentives, where some countries in the region are very active. Australia has been doing a lot of things on land and water, for example. Korea has also been implementing green incentives in the area of electric vehicles. We see also green procurement as an area where some countries like Malaysia are moving forward, and they seem to be bringing results. Another area also is for the facilitation of transfer of technology, is ensuring intellectual property protection in some of the economies that are, let's say, hosting those investments. And finally, the third aspect, I would say, is not necessarily cross-border, but it's about improving the bankability of the investment projects. And that requires not only improving the monitoring, but also the assessment of standards of the projects that are going to be part of foreign investors. And that's something that is a domestic issue, but that requires more focus perhaps from governments in the region to enhance those standards. Thank you.
Actually, he mentioned Australia. I don't know if you want to react or comment. I know you've also been doing some work on international investment agreements.
Oh, thank you. As ever, Janssen, among others in the audience, may know I love talking about international investment agreements. So yes, I will take you up. Firstly, I love the idea for some sort of model agreement or opt-in mechanism because, as Janssen knows from the discussion he facilitated the other day, we all agree that something needs to change, and the question is really how do we change the regime quickly when you've got this spaghetti bowl of thousands, literally thousands of investment treaties. So really love that idea. One option is to sort of carve out for certain sectors. There are options like my proposal with Jonathan Benicia, which take a more fundamental, let's look at the economic objective of investment treaties and redesign the damages, or the compensation rule in accordance with that. And one of the reasons I'm very much in favour with that, other than I spent 3 years writing it, is that as it might seem relatively easy at the moment to say, let's carve out coal and then maybe we'll carve out gas. But as we move rapidly through this transition, what is an environmentally preferred product or what is a relatively climate-friendly product is going to be a moving feast. And so designing those carve-outs is going to be tricky. So that's why I favour a mechanism that just, uses economic theory to actually very clearly delineate A, what we should be not paying compensation for, but B, to also design a compensation scheme that is actually compatible with best practice green industrial policy, which requires systematic updating of your policies. So an investment treaty that promises, that locks in a policy, even if it is, a feed-in tariff, as the Spanish learnt, is not compatible with best practice green industrial policy.
Great, thanks. And this, I think, points out a broader point about climate strategy, and that is that there's so much urgency now. Different countries are trying to come up with lists of things that they can do, project policy, but it really needs to be guided by kind of a strategy that sees the whole field and sees the interactions, both within countries but also across countries. And that's still, I think, we're challenged to get there. And so I appreciate this comment that we need to start from the fundamentals and identify where we're trying to get, really, and not try to be distracted by measures that really actually get us somewhere, but not really exactly where we want to head. Great. Okay, so the panelists have been very efficient with their time allocation, so we're going to go for a second round of questions. So back to Ben. I wanted to ask you about kind of controversies about reporting systems on emissions produced, carbon offsets, et cetera. How do we stand right now on reporting systems for carbon reduction? What are the obstacles, and can it be improved?
Yeah, let me just first of all say I really appreciate this conversation, because talking across different knowledge sources is going to be key for thinking about what mechanisms work best and most efficiently. And I love this idea about embedding trade and finance, but the question still remains, how do we think about then the actual emissions that come from these goods, especially given they are moving targets? And so one of the projects that one of my former students was working on, she's now a doctoral student at Stanford, Li was on how do we understand then the world in terms of the accounting aspects of the carbon crisis. And it turns out there are a number of challenges here. And by the way, there's an article in Nature now, a collaborative article with her and Amy Scher, and myself and a few others about the document, then the challenges of just doing the accounting needed to generate the adequate knowledge around what a good and service actually means in terms of the emissions. And it's difficult for a few reasons. There are different accounting standards. There's global standards, there's some that are private, and there's some that are engaged by NGOs. And even companies have their own standards. So you're reporting on well-intended efforts, but they're not linked together in a common, what we're calling for a ledger. So, and this is a huge problem. If you've got fragmented accounting standards, even if each one is well-intended, the upshot is that you may actually have double counting, or you might not actually understand then the leakage effects that are occurring, or ignore leakage effects, let alone getting at scope 1, 2, and 3 in a systematic way. So we feel we need almost a moonshot, just an accounting ledger through which all of our efforts can actually be compared to each other. And we can go to one place and get a pretty good sense of what we're doing now makes sense given the emissions taking place. But right now, when you do carbon accounting, you'll often find huge debates about even what a company is doing on its deforestation requirements and climate change because of then how they're measuring those impacts, or even the role of methane as either a narrow or broader source of production. We need to have the accounting done. It's not there. It's not close to being there. And we see this as being a fundamental bedrock for making a difference in nurturing these kinds of policy design mechanisms. I would also add, too, a lot of work's been done on pricing. You guys are working on pricing. And Vino Thomas, who was at the ADB and World Bank and now was on faculty here for many years and a key member of EYES, has a book coming out on climate change where he also discusses the need for pricing mechanisms as a key part of this acceleration as well.
Okay, that did not sound very optimistic on the measurement issue, so I'm wondering
can I jump
if
in?
you, where is the optimism? I'll give it to Ben first, and then maybe hand it over to.
Let me give you, I would say the optimism comes from the fact that there's now a widespread consensus that this has to be done and done systematically. There's the global stock take happening, and people now are thinking about these questions. So the moment is quite pivotal. And it's not like people are fighting this anymore. They're, how do we do it in a really good way? And this is a sea change from even 10, 15 years ago. So the past is not optimistic, but this is also kind of I'm not going to say a low-lying fruit, but it's doable. We can do this if we do it really well. And now given the excitement, what's happening across the world, your report in Singapore, the potential is there to make a difference. Yeah, that's optimistic, eh?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
And when you mentioned the ledger, it made me think of the blockchain maybe as a tool where people can just update things without any deep knowledge of the requirements. Emma, you wanted to respond?
I really want to read your Nature article, but just to highlight Australia and Singapore's efforts again. So we're actually got an Australian Research Council grant together with the Australian government looking at development of a public embedded emissions accounting system, what the Australian government refers to a guarantee of origin scheme. And of course, alignment of our system with the Singaporean system is one of the regulatory collaboration features in the Green Economy Agreement. So industry, private sector have been leading the way for many years. There's proliferation from those efforts. There's also a lot of people who see if I control the ledger, I can have a fair bit of power and money. So there's a lot going on at the moment. What I think is fantastic is that the governments and the public sector are starting to step up now, and that's really going to help with those issues of compatibility and what is that single one ledger, which of course reduces regulatory burden, because if you have to meet 5 different, emissions accounting standards to get your product certified for 5 different markets, that's a huge burden.
Can I add to that for one quick sec? On the certification part, it's really important because for 2 reasons. One, when it comes to, for example, forests and certification there, you can have some natural disturbance or it might be, or for example, a fire that might even have some climate change origins that end up actually really putting out of whack that accounting. And how companies and governments account for that are very different right now. There's not a simple system for that, creating debates about then whether this is a natural emission or whether it's more of a sink that you can achieve credits for by planting. But it gets more complicated because you can give a certificate, and then new information could come along about how the forest works. So for example, there's these economists at Yale that have found that the way that leaves decompose within forests, even across half a kilometer, are different, such that you need to model the effects of that decomposition and the climate emissions at that kind of fine-grained scale if you want to really be able to understand whether you've got leakage or not. And likewise, carbon flows through water systems in forests, therefore changing the existing models that we have that countries often use to develop their Paris Accord forestry commitments. So this kind of real-time data into the ledger would be required. It's doable, but it requires a lot more fine-grained analyses than we're doing now with our certification certificates.
Right. So that example is really good. It really highlights the measurement challenge of trying to capture all of the ways in which any activity affects the climate, right? So Emma, let me turn to you. The report also discusses embedded emissions and how to measure. And that's, of course, key for some of the proposed carbon border adjustment mechanisms, which are trying to say, if your products that we're importing contain so much carbon, then we're going to somehow tax you on that if you're not charging a tax yourself. Do you want to say a few words about what we know about best practice for measuring embedded emissions and what needs to be done to make sure such measurement is as scientific and transparent and interoperable as possible?
Yeah, and this is really, apologies, I jumped in and half answered that question already. So when I'm referring to embedded emissions, public embedded emissions accounting system, that's exactly the conversation we were just having, this guarantee of origin. And of course, the European Union's carbon border adjustment mechanism has been really the impetus for a lot of countries to realize they need to get this sorted, because if they don't have their own embedded emissions accounting system that the EU will acknowledge, then they'll have to just do it however the EU tells them to do it, which might not be particularly well suited to their own economies. So a key thing, of course, for countries that are often only one particular part of complex global value chains, like most of the region, including Australia, we're usually at one particular end of them, is that these embedded emissions accounting systems need to be interoperable across countries. Otherwise, those of us who are part of complex chains versus producers in Europe or the US who have kind of the whole value chain from digging it out of the ground to end consumer in one place will have a disproportionate regulatory burden. So that's why this interoperability of systems, so that we can add in a modular way those emissions along the value chain, is really important to minimizing the trade impacts of this brave new world.
Yeah.
And in the report, we also point out that we're very concerned that, as you mentioned, some of the less developed countries in the region will struggle with this capability to measure embedded carbon emissions, and they may be punished by adjustment mechanisms that just start to assume the worst kind of about what goods are being imported if it's undocumented, right? And so that capability requires a lot of support, I think.
Absolutely.
Great. So, and let me finally give Rolando another question about a topic that I personally think is really a critical one, and that's about carbon pricing. I was wondering if you could just update us a little bit on the status of the development of carbon markets in the region, and what do you see as some of the obstacles and opportunities to achieve more widespread carbon pricing? I mean, I feel very frustrated in some way at the slow pace of this in terms of governments being really willing to adopt carbon pricing mechanisms in the region.
Thank you, Albert. Well, as Benjamin pointed out at the beginning, there have been discussions for 2 decades over these issues. For those of us who entered the discussion a bit later, these issues are kind of interesting because things have changed in some way. For example, with the carbon border adjustment mechanism and the discussions with the EU. That's something that we want to understand better from the perspective of Asia, how these market-based mechanisms, either as a carbon tax or as a carbon pricing system, can respond and can be adjusted. In terms of development of international carbon markets, we highlight in the report different developments with the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, as it was briefly mentioned by Jong-woo in the presentation, the introduction of regional carbon market alliances, which can be potentially interesting for some economies in the region to form some sort of critical mass, not only for negotiations, but also for capacity building and for upgrading in a lot of these issues. There are many issues that I think, just to echo what Benjamin mentioned about design features that are still under discussion and they need to be addressed. And today, probably we know a bit better what has not worked. We don't know exactly what will work. In terms of, for example, voluntary carbon markets, there is discussions in terms of how the additionality they can bring, in terms of the verification systems that are in place. And there is a learning process on that. So I think something we try to highlight in the report is that there is already experience on that and things that have worked or not worked. Other aspects that we highlight are on the linking of emission trading systems, direct or indirect linking. They have different effects or implications, and how they can be better adapted to the context of Asian economy. So that's something that still needs much further discussion, and it's something that is promising in terms of how things are moving with the implementation of certain aspects of Article 6, but clearly there are still many obstacles or aspects that need to be decided and solved to have a truly functional global carbon market.
Yeah. As economists, we often think, oh, let's create a market.
Right.
There should be a market. Yeah. But I think we're learning that it takes a lot of work to create a market for especially carbon markets when there's so many issues related to incentives and political economy, but also measurement and verification. But I think it's, despite the challenges, we really have to keep pushing, because it's really critical to reaching net zero goals in an efficient way. Otherwise, it'll be much more costly to economies than is necessary. Okay, great. I want to Are there questions from the audience? Oh, okay, great. Let's take some questions. There's 2 mics in either aisle, so can I ask, we'll go here and then here. Can you step up to the mic and also just introduce your name and affiliation, and then raise your question and try to, don't make it too long-winded. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thang Nguyen from Oxford Economics. I have 2 questions. The first one is we've been talking about global cooperation, but it seems there's a lot of geopolitical conflicts right now. And I wonder how would you see it being squared with geopolitical tension? If it worsens, what would be the impact on trade investment in the region and how it affects our ability to tackle climate change through trade? That's question number 1. Question number 2 is probably related to the discussion from our friend Rolando there on FDI, particularly on the point about reshoring, which is a discussion we've been here for many years. Some say it's happening, some point it doesn't. So I wonder if that's something we see with the latest data that you're seeing that is reshoring in the region. Thank you.
Great. So Rolando, definitely you can tackle the reshoring question. I don't know if anyone wants to grab the geopolitical tension.
As a political scientist, I think I should.
Oh, political, I didn't know you were a political scientist. Okay, all right. Okay,
I'll have a little
dab at it. Okay, so Ben, why don't you start then? That was the first question.
Okay. Well, I mean, there's a long conversation there, but of course, geopolitics matters in a number of ways for this conversation. One is just the salience of the climate crisis, which is we're seeing now in the geopolitics a greater consensus, something has to be done, and also a great move towards finance and market-driven mechanisms as part of that solution. So people are now juggling around how to handle that. And of course, then we have the challenge of, is it really around decarbonization, or is it around protectionism? Is it around self-interest? How do we handle those dynamic aspects? So I would say a couple of things in that regard. Even framing the problem, there was an article published 3 years ago, and it asked the question, of all the CO2 emissions in the atmosphere, which is the major greenhouse gas responsible for our crisis, not the only one, of all the emissions in the atmosphere, how much of those were produced by Annex I countries, the North, essentially? And of course, as you know, CO2 sits there for 300 years in the atmosphere, so whatever they did before matters as much as they do now, right? And the answer was 92%, okay, 92%. We often forget that when we're looking at contemporary challenges as well. But there are historical challenges that Annex I countries have to own up to, and I wonder whether the geopolitics is such that we're not thinking about that specific data set anymore. We're going, the EU is doing this cool stuff, the US has got the Inflation Reduction Act. Well, they also have to make massive changes just to get up to where they should be, or otherwise they're harming Asia and Southeast Asia more than they're actually helping Asia, which leads to the second part of the issue, the carbon border adjustment mechanisms, our geopolitics, right? So what are they going to do? Are they going to be protectionist efforts, or are they actually the EU and the US, despite having historical legacies, are now saying that the problem is Southeast Asia, not us? Is that going to be the orientation? Or are they going to help the decarbonization, de-intensification efforts taking place in the region? And to me, it's not preordained. That actually it does matter. These micro-level design principles do matter because the initiators are well-intended in Annex I countries now. This is not simply a protectionist measure. There are a lot of well-intended efforts. So how you design for this well-intended effort, to me, becomes really important. And I can say more about how you would do that, but to me, the devils are going to be in the design. And Southeast Asia has to be part of that design conversation versus just perceiving it as kind of the case now. Last little example, 15 years ago, China was producing and giving incentives and subsidies to companies to produce solar panels, a good thing for the world, right? Giving to the world cheap solar energy. And the US launched a protectionist claim against the Chinese for dumping solar panels on US consumers, thinking more of their industrial interests versus the climate. And they won. And Chinese solar panel called Yingli went out of business as a result of this. So it works in both directions too as well, and how we think therefore about unifying geopolitics and protectionism around decarbonization is one of the most important questions of our times. We cannot decouple them. It must always be linked to our designs on the finance and market-driven side of things too.
Great. Yeah, I mean, whether for historical justice reasons or even just current efficient paths to reach global targets, there really should be a big flow of funding coming from the north to the south.
Yeah.
I mean, even if you forget history, just to get where we need to go, this is going to have to happen given the huge financing gaps for climate in poorer countries.
Yep. Agreed.
So, but that's a point well taken. You wanted to jump in?
Just to observe that this shift away from a focus on efficiency towards resilience in sort of language from governments, and this technology competition and the geoeconomics or geopolitical tensions, there's a lot of bad things that come out of that. But, you know, we do get some freebies in that part of the massive amounts of money that countries are putting into green industrial policy, and part of the driver for these, what I think are quite cool things called international green economy collaborations, is exactly those motivations. So, you know, sometimes not everything about those drivers, of course, is good, but sometimes governments do end up doing a bit of the right thing for the wrong reasons.
I have to think about that one. I guess it's better than doing the wrong things for the right reasons, right? Okay. Ron, we had the question about reshoring for you.
Yeah, thank you, Albert. Thank you, Tang, for the question. Nice to see you. Well, I think the short answer, and perhaps John and Albert can complement, is that despite all this rhetoric of fragmentation, the data doesn't seem to show yet this type of reshoring effect as strong as it seems. That's on the GBC or the data that ADB collects on multi-regional input-output tables. In terms of FDI, which I'm a bit more familiar with, we also don't see that effect. There is maybe some divestments, for example, and some reallocation, but the effects are not as strong. And to give an example, China, which is still the main FDI recipient in the region, has very strong FDI linkages across all sectors, despite the discussions on possible reshoring or diversification of the investment. So that would be my short answer, but I'm sure Albert has a lot more ideas on that.
No, I think we don't see anything in the data that reshoring is happening. I think some people argue that there's suggestive evidence of, you know, supply chains being diversified, especially for some goods and from some multinationals moving out of China to diversify geopolitical risk, but no strong evidence of reshoring in my view. And I think that makes sense. I mean, it's very inefficient, to be honest. Okay, so we had another question up here, and then we'll come to the front. Go ahead.
Hello. Jan Calamita, Center for International Law, Program on Investment Law and Policy. Thank you very much for the presentations. As a lawyer, it's kind of bewildering to hear all of the proposals and all of the things that economists and policymakers think that we need to do, and to sort of think about the implementation side and the drafting and negotiation of agreements that are needed to support these great ideas. And whilst systemic approaches would be brilliant, we know that international regulatory systems don't develop that way. They tend to develop in a piecemeal way. So I wonder if each member of the panel could name one piece of low-hanging fruit that can be harvested and actually make a difference. And secondly, what's the most important thing that would take more time but is perhaps worthy of the greatest amount of attention in order to achieve perhaps before others? Thank you.
Okay. Anyone want to respond first?
Well, I can start by saying you've asked the two questions that frame an entire class that I teach. So how do I handle this in just a couple of minutes? And I would say the following, and it goes back to this conversation, I think, doing good for the wrong reasons, you said, or something. So I would say, you know, as a political scientist working on these questions and thinking about, you know, your point that globally, you know, we're not getting the action that would be this logical, do this, cause and outcome. is in part related to this concept I developed with 3 colleagues that sees climate change as a super wicked problem. And some of the features include time is running out, which means that there's an urgency. But the second feature is that those causing the problem also want to solve the problem, okay? And then the third one is no central authority. So when you think about these features, you think, okay, we are all in some way protectionists. We want to do our interested things that benefit our own societies, but we also are global citizens and we care about this planet. So we're having these conflicts not just with others, but with ourselves. So how do you handle this when you haven't got central authority, you don't have any of the elegant top-down kind of approach that you were talking we don't have? And the answer is you've got to have 1,000 different triggers that are initiated all over the place that might have some potential for over time ratcheting up. And there's got to be a logic where the trigger itself can do something that locks us into the future versus putting the future off, right? So one example I referred to metaphorically a lot that I think gets at your question at least, one example is the first feed-in tariff program the world had was in Germany. And this was developed around 17 years ago by some German government officials that were like, how do we accelerate decarbonization given there's no global mandate to do so? And they developed an idea about how do we actually change the norms in Germany, not accept the norms? How do we change the incentives and increase then the uptake of green energy? What do? They changed the traditional approach of subsidies, where you subsidize for a solar panel or windmill, to instead contracts, where they said, if you undertake solar panels on your rooftop, we give you a 20-year contract to do so, or we'll give you each year a payment back to pay off your solar panel. The contract approach instead of a subsidy made it much more difficult to withdraw that program. It was sticky because you've got to pay compensation costs to the homeowners when you make it a contract, not a subsidy. No cost to governments, design made it more durable. Then they said, oh, and if you produce more energy than you actually consume, which is a behavioral issue, we'll pay you the retail rate for that, not the wholesale rate, also in the contract. What did that do? It caused low carbon behaviors to also make money, which over time led to a norm change among Germans that then led to increasing demand for solar panels, which led to companies emerging that didn't exist to produce this supply, that then led to greater economic interest producing and maintaining the policy itself. That story is to say, we can do that all over the place. We can do it in Singapore and Southeast Asia, we can do that, but the logic for these steps has to be in place when you first start. And to me, that involves bringing people in this room together, the nitty-gritty of design, different knowledge sources where you can identify cool possibilities like that. And we're not doing that very well these days. And that, to me, is where we might open up door number 2.
Great. Emma, do you want to?
My answer on the low-hanging fruit is, once again, I'm a big fan of these international green economy collaborations. So I've just done a bit of a survey of them internationally. Almost none of them actually put legally binding obligations on the states. The reason they work is that they're economic and environmental win-wins. This is voluntary cooperation. It helps the politics internationally, it helps the politics domestically, and it saves us having to spend 20 years that we don't have negotiating formal legally binding agreements. So that's my answer on the low-hanging fruit. The thing that's going to be really hard, but we're going to need, I think Ben and I are probably in fierce agreement, is getting the carbon accounting right, because you can't get the price mechanisms, right, and those price signals without having that, because you know, I can't see how much embodied carbon there is in that glass in front of me.
Rolando, do you want to?
Well, perhaps I will mention as the low-hanging fruit the equity limitations in investment on some sectors where the needs are so large and the economic argument seems to be pushing also for lifting some of those restrictions. We looked at what are the countries that have these restrictions in the region, and sometimes it's difficult to understand the logic. It's not like in other sectors where there is a clearly more protectionist perspective on those industries. So that could be something that it's being implemented by some economies, and that could be considered given the needs for financing the transition and could attract investment. That would be my answer.
So I just piggybacking on this last idea, So the Philippines is an example where they had a restrictive foreign investment law where there was you could only do joint ventures, and a lot of renewable energy companies didn't want to come in and do large renewable projects because of this restriction. And then the new administration said, okay, we waive that for renewable, in the renewable energy sector. So now there's much more interest as an example of that. But I think more broadly, I would also just push the basic idea of the first recommendation of the report, which is promoting more freer trade of environmental goods and services, because I feel like it's an easy concept. When we think about any essential good, whether it be medical goods during a pandemic or food during a food security crisis globally or climate, I think we've been consistently saying you just cannot impose trade restrictions on these goods because it inhibits the flow and the cost of these goods when they're really important. And if we think about environmental goods in these ways and say, just stop with the tariffs, stop with any investment restriction, and if there's other barriers, deal with them to promote the free flow of these key environmental goods and services, including renewable energy investments, but many other things that need to go in. I think that's really, will be really helpful to developing countries who really need these technologies, really for, and even some of the big countries like China, Indonesia, India, you know, where they really just need to reduce the carbon intensity of their production quickly. And the only way to do that in an environment where they still want to grow is to, on the technology side, right, to do that. So I think that's a simple idea that we should just keep emphasizing.
Yeah, good point.
Okay, so we had a question up here. Did you want to, please go up to the mic. And this may be our last, there's one more over here. Well, let's see how we do. We need to stop on time at 11:30.
So, hi, this is Vikram from the Straits Times. Thank you for the discussion. The report said that Asia is one of the most vulnerable regions in the world to climate change, if not the most vulnerable. And there's been a very rich discussion, but it's almost totally focused on mitigation. I didn't hear adaptation mentioned even once. The question that I have, I mean, we've seen what's happened in Pakistan with the floods, in Germany, in California, and elsewhere, just last year. So the big question, I think, that a lot of people are asking is, should we be front-loading our expenditure on adaptation? A lot of countries have made provisions for this, but Singapore has made over 100 years. This is not a 100-year problem. This is a here-and-now problem. So how do we deal with this? Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Any takers on adaptation?
You want to go first?
No, I'm good.
I mean, it's a really, thank you for raising the question, because, I mean, going back to the statistic I raised my earlier point, 92% of emissions being caused by Annex 1 countries, the impacts on Southeast Asia are going to be devastating. And therefore, adaptation has to happen, and it has to be done in a way that can respond to projections that we've now unleashed. So I hope we didn't give the impression that adaptation wasn't important. It's critically important, and responsibilities for that are really key. What I would say is there's 4 ways to think about adaptation, and it's around the notion of 4 different ways in which equity is thought of in the world. So one is equity for how we do mitigation, and this is a debate about who should do what. One is equity for who should pay for the adaptation that has to occur. How do you actually adapt in some way? And here again, going back to this moral imperative that the North really must be spending a lot more on financing for adaptation. And again, Singapore has led the way on both the technological and knowledge sources about how to adapt given what's going to be coming, and can, I think, diffuse that knowledge usefully in Southeast Asia. But 2 other ways are also emerging too. The third is the compensation aspect, which is if you can't adapt well, how do you compensate countries now? And this has become actually a topic in global climate governance, the compensation issue, and there was some move on Charm in that regard. And to me, that's a third way that Southeast Asia can get involved in on that, where you can't adapt, at least get compensated by Annex 1 countries. And then the last one is integration. Because Southeast Asia isn't just around climate change, it's around sustainable development. And you've got a bunch of different goals behind that need to be integrated in some way around, but not completely controlled by the climate crisis. So to me, a greater unpacking of these 4 different ways to think about equity and where adaptation fits is important, but also to go beyond that, to really think about smart ways to allow for this development to occur that also recognize the responsibilities of the North in causing this problem. A short answer to a really important question. Did not mean to undermine it in any way. It's really fundamentally important.
So I agree that there has to be a balance. We need to do both. Obviously, what the right balance is, I think people can argue about, and it may be different for different countries depending on the risks that they face and the climate reduction opportunities that they have. But at ADB, we're certainly doing quite a lot of work in areas like infrastructure resilience, disaster preparedness, and making agricultural more sustainable and more climate resistant. So that's certainly an important part of the agenda. Unfortunately, we're at time, so I know there might have been 1 or 2 other questions. Feel free to come up and talk to the panelists when we close, but I want to thank all of our panelists for a really stimulating and interesting discussion. Thanks so much.
Yeah.